Okay. All right. Perfect. Can you all hear me well? Yes? All right, excellent. So thank you to ITAP for sponsoring this webinar, which is our 7th webinar of the year. Okay. We are going to start today with a pop quiz. You don't have to answer, but I would like you to think about the answers in your mind before we begin, right? So of course, isn't a webinar about assessment, I'm going to start with a pop quiz. So read each situation and decide which is the best solution. So you're writing a multiple choice exam for your students, right? Which is a potential threat to the reliability of your exam? Using 3 options as distractors, keeping all common language in the stem, providing an answer pattern, like for example, A, B, C, D. So your correct answer is A, your correct answer is B, your correct answer is C and D, and then A, B, C, D again. Some teachers like to do that because it's easy to score if you're manually scoring a test, right? And avoid copying language that is exactly on the text or on the test itself onto the questions. So if you had to choose one of these options, which one would be a potential threat to the reliability? Feel free to share your answer out loud, or if you would like to type it in the chat as well. A, B, C, or D? Okay. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one, and then we can talk about our answers. Teachers often expand the true or false format to include a not enough information option. This has the advantage of reducing the guess factor and requiring more cognitive processing of information. However, it is not appropriate for which language skill? So if you have true, false, not enough, or not given, right? What does research suggest? That it's not appropriate for grammar, for listening, for reading, or for vocab? And the last one is, you are about to assess student writing. What is the best strategy to ensure high reliability of your grading? Require students to write a draft, give students a very detailed prompt, use multiple raters in a grading scale, and use free writing instead of guided writing. So A, B, C, or D. All right, so we have some answers in the chat here. All right, so let me go back, and I'm going to go back to the first question. You're writing a multiple choice exam for your students. A potential threat to reliability would be letter. Can anybody share their answer? Oh, this is going to be a good webinar. If you're all right, so it would be letter C, right? Exactly, Luba. Thank you. Providing an answer pattern, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, right? We don't want to do that when we are writing a multiple choice exam, even though it makes it easier for us to remember to score. That is a threat to the reliability of the exam. All the other ones are things that you want to be doing. You want to be using 3 or 4 options as distractors, depending on the kind of test, and we're going to be talking about that as well. You want to keep common language in the stem, and you want to avoid verbatim language from the text or the test, right? For the not enough information option, if you do that, which one do researchers say that it is not appropriate? Which skill? And the answer to this one would be listening. Right? The students already have a lot of input that they have to remember, because usually they listen to the passage once or twice only. So research has shown that including a not enough information option to listening tasks in which you are writing true or false items can be more demanding of the test takers and not necessarily making the task more challenging, right? And if you're about to assess student writing, and the best strategy to ensure high reliability would be to use multiple raters and a grading scale, right? But that, in fact, it may be not possible if it's just a classroom assessment, right? We tend to use multiple raters and a grading scale if you're doing a placement test or proficiency test, but not so much in for time constraints and resources and so on, to use that in classroom assessment. So these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about today with regards to developing test items and things that we should be thinking about, right? Other things that we should be thinking about as well, and I'm going to be mentioning today, are the mechanics, right, of writing multiple choice items and writing test items. And you can see here in these three examples some of these strategies already being used, right? So for example, when you're writing a multiple choice question, right, you see here that I have a question as my stem, because the multiple choice questions are divided into like the stem and the options, right, which are the distractors and the key answer. And so here you see that I have consistency, right? I start all of them with a gerund. And they're not sentences, they're just gerund phrases, right? No periods at the end, and I'm being consistent, right? So this is one thing that you want to be doing when you're writing a multiple choice item. In this case here as well, right, I am keeping it consistent. The length is the same, right? I'm following the same format. But here, I have an actual sentence, right? So I'm starting with a capital letter and ending with a period. And you see again that the length of the options are basically the same, right? So these are some things that researchers suggest that you should do when you're writing a good multiple choice item. And I have to say that a lot of the research on writing tasks and items come from educational measurement research, right? So it's not necessarily coming from language writing research or language testing research. It's basically, most of it is coming from educational measurement, right? All right, so our focus today is on writing tasks and writing items. And before we get to it, I have to make a difference for the purposes of this webinar between items and tasks, right? So items, for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to be referring to selected response questions. For example, multiple choice, true or false, matching items, right? And tasks would be constructed response questions. For example, essays, papers, or giving a presentation, or group interaction, a group discussion, right? So we have this distinction here for the purposes of this webinar. And why am I saying for the purposes of this webinar? Well, because when you read research on it, you see them used interchangeably, right? Items and tasks, right? And a language assessment task, be it an item or a task, is a task whose purpose is to collect samples of students' language performance, right? And so you will see in both the educational measurement research and also language assessment research, the word item and task sometimes used interchangeably. I would rather it not be. I think the distinction is very clear between what an item is and what a task is. So for the purposes of this webinar, we'll have this distinction, right? So we have to think how important it is when we are creating our tasks. And not only when we are creating our tasks, but also, or in items, but also when we are evaluating, for example, a task that comes with a textbook or a task that was given to us, right? And why is that? Because when you look at the assessment tasks and items that you have on a test, right, that is going to show you how much the students know and what their ability is, right, in the language, what they can do and what they have learned in your class. So from there, you're going to use the results of that task that you created or that you selected, right, to give them a score. And then you're going to have to make interpretations about their language ability based on what you did. Then you're going to have to make decisions about, For example, what are you going to be teaching next? Do you have to reinforce what you taught before, right? Are the students going to move up as consequences of your tasks, right? So the reason why I have this here is that we have to be very careful when we are designing our tests. It carries a lot of weight into what we're doing. It's the material, right? It's the tool that we're using to assess our students. So we have to put a lot of care and effort into developing our assessment materials, our assessment tools, right? Just create, I have a quiz tomorrow. I'm going to put together like a 5-question quiz and give to the students, right? We have to think about the cornerstones of testing. We have to think if the test is valid, if it's reliable. And it boils down to the kinds of tasks that you're asking your students to do, right? So we have to keep this in mind. And I really like this this diagram here, right, with the links between how the students perform on your tasks that you chose to include, right, and then all the things that can happen based on what you decided to use in your test, right? So it's very important. In an ideal world, and that's how Grabowski and Akin describe it on their paper, on the book chapter, they say in an ideal world, there should be an alignment between the instructional tasks and the tasks. And by tasks here, tasks and items, you can understand that. And also an alignment between the tasks and the real life tasks the test takers will be asked to perform outside of the test. So keep that in mind. You want to have an alignment between what you're teaching, right? And also an alignment between what you're asking them to do and what they're going to be performing out in the language, in the world, right? The target language use. Just like you think about it when you're preparing your classroom lessons and everything, right? And that's very important as well. Test what has been taught and how it has been taught, right? Is a premise for content validity, right? And using formats and techniques they are familiar with. And why am I bringing this up here? Well, because the tasks and the items that you're going to have your students perform on the test that you develop, they should be items and tasks that are familiar to your students, right? So let's start talking about our planning stages before we actually get down to the actual writing of the items. So there are a couple of things that you have to think about when you are planning, when you're about to, okay, I'm going to design this assessment, right? Well, you have to think, like, why are you assessing? Like, do you need to assess at this point, right? What is the purpose of this assessment? Is it a diagnostic assessment to see how much students know? Is it a formative assessment to just indicate to me how students are progressing in the course, right? And if I have to make any modifications? Is it a summative assessment to see how much students learned throughout the course, right? What kind of information do I need to get from it? Because what kind of information you need and what abilities you need to measure, that will dictate what kind of items and tasks that you are going to select for your assessment test or tool, right? What kind of mental model do I have of these abilities? And I think it's an interesting way to put it. A mental model would be our construct, right? What is our construct for the test? And what is our idea of language ability, right? So for example, let's say that in class, you're focusing on language as a vehicle for communication, and you're teaching them pragmatics, and you're teaching the students how to communicate in the real world. And then you give them a quiz that is just grammar questions or fill in the blanks, right? There's a mismatch there. And we all know when there is a mismatch between what we teach and how we teach, it can deeply affect what students understand and perceive as important in your class as well, right? And it's like, oh, we're focusing on this in class, and then I am being tested on this. Also issues of fairness, right? Is it fair to be tested on something that we are not focusing on in class, right? So it's very important that we have to have these things in mind as we are designing, and it's for anything, right? It could be a short quiz that you're preparing for tomorrow. You have to keep thinking about these things, not only for the most important and the big tests, but also for the smallest tasks as well. Now, another decision that you have to make and you have to think, do you want to assess a skill directly or indirectly at this point in the course? We all know that to test these skills directly, like as direct performance, right, is the end goal of doing it. But you may want, for example, in a writing class, to first test their ability to put a sentence together instead of going straight to the production of an essay, right? So you may want to test the skills indirectly at that point, right? So you have to think about that as well. Well, resources are available for you in terms of time, right? Technology and other things that you have to take into consideration as well. And this is also very important. Objectives, right? So when you create a test, you're testing the different learning outcomes, right, in one test, or maybe you're testing two, let's say you're testing two learning outcomes on a test, right? Will they receive the same weight when you are creating your test? Will it be 10 points for this and 10 points for this outcome? Are they equally important, or are some more fundamental than others? Will that determine how many points you allocate for each question? So this is something that you should be thinking about as you are developing your questions, right? And then the other thing too is that, do you want to have a balance between, for example, okay, are my multiple choice questions or my items, right, my true, false, my matching exercises worth a lot more than the constructed response items? So I am placing a lot more emphasis, okay, students, on the selected response items as opposed to tasks, right? So you have to keep those things in mind when you're allocating points as well, right? And this goes into the writing of your test. And again, testing should reflect teaching and the amount of time spent on something in the classroom, right? So, and you have to think about that in terms of like how many questions you have and what is the focus of your test, right? So if you spent the entire test on one outcome and then you just have one short answer or like short exercise at the very end about another outcome, right? And so you have to think about it, whether they are equally important, whether or not, or if it's something that is building up to get somewhere else. So you have to have these considerations when you are developing your test, right? All right, let's keep going here. A lot of times when we see the word specifications, a lot of people are afraid of them. This is usually more like, it's often used for more standardized tests when you're creating different versions of a test, right? It's very important to have specifications, but I would argue that it's also important to at least have mental specifications of what you are writing for your test, right? Your classroom assessment, right? What you are assessing and how you're going to go about it, right? So have an idea of like, what is the description of the assessment, what I want to do with it, what am I testing with it, the skills and the outcomes, right? The techniques for assessing those skills, and by techniques, I mean the format and the task and the items, right? The types of prompts, the expected type of response for each task, the timing for the task, the expected level of performance and grading criteria, right? Because once you have all this in either in writing or in your head, it will contribute to transparency because you're going to be able to communicate your expectations to the students, right? You will assure that you will contribute to having validity, because then you're making sure, okay, I am testing this and this is how I'm testing. Am I getting the information that I need with these tasks that I have, right? Also reliability, let's say that you want to make different versions of this test or reuse it, so you have different consistent versions of it. That allows for reliability as well, and consistency of scoring, and also accountability, right? So let's go into developing our test, right? And yes, I just saw it in the chat here, connection to the course objective is very important, exactly, right? The skills and the outcomes of your course. All right, so this is something, at least for me, that sometimes like I'm so used, like I have my favorite types of items and tasks. I'm sure that you probably have those like, oh, go-to types of items and tests when you start writing your test, but that sometimes I forget to think about other things that we could be doing when we are writing our tasks and items, right? So we have to think of this distinction between the elicitation mode and the response mode, right? So the elicitation is the way in which responses are prompted, and the response is the way a student can respond to a question. What does that mean? Well, if you have students can listen to something, and then after listening, they can speak about it or they can write about it, right? Or after reading something, they can speak about it and they can write about it. And sometimes I feel like we're so used to testing only one or two ways only. Like, for example, students listen to something, then they do a multiple choice task, right? Or they read something and then they're asked to write about it, right? So it's important to think that there are other ways. You can do multiple choice questions, for example, with students listening to the stem, and then you checking, and then they check the right answer, right? So there are different ways if you think about different elicitation modes and response modes. But of course, the selection of whatever mode you choose for both the elicitation and the response will depend on the nature of the information that stakeholders need to get from tests, right? For example, students can listen to a dialogue as an oral prompt and then write short answers in response, right? So this is just the mixing. And there's a bunch of combinations that you can have within the prompts and the responses. Right, so you can combine prompts and responses, like I said. But we got to be very careful, because skill contamination can happen at this stage, right? So for example, if you require too much prompt reading for a listening task, or if you give a long listening prompt for a writing task, then their understanding of the prompt itself can affect how they perform on the actual task that you're requiring them to do. So we have to be very careful when we are creating our tasks to avoid skill contamination, right? We want to get at what students are able to do, and we don't want our instructions, we don't want the language in our STEM, we don't want the prompt itself to be an obstacle for the students to show us what they can do, right? So we have to be careful with that. Because poor item and task writing causes construct irrelevant variables to influence measurement, and this is something that we want to avoid, right? Our language must be clear, precise, and unencumbered by superfluous or difficult language. So be very careful with how you're stating your instructions and your questions, because a lot of the times they can be ambiguous, right? And you didn't even think about it, but then the way students read it, it may be open to different interpretation, and you don't want that. You want to be as objective as possible, right? Also, if the item or task is more difficult than it needs to be, then it will measure the test taker's ability to understand the item text in addition to their ability to comprehend the stimulus. And that's neither fair nor valid. So we have to be very careful of how we word our tasks and what kind of instructions we're having students follow, right? Other items, other things that we have to keep in mind is fairness, right? We need, yes, you're getting the slides later on, yes. And that's also why I'm asking for emails so that I can send those slides to you. So an item that is unfair allows some test takers or groups of test takers to perform better or worse than other test takers of the same ability, right? So you want to avoid bias in the language, in the topic, right, that you're choosing, because you want to be fair to your students. You want everybody to have the same opportunity to perform at the level that they are, right? And it is your responsibility to ensure that the items and the tasks, right, are equally accessible to test takers from different backgrounds, right? Because then again, it all leads to construct irrelevance variance. So a lot of things can cause construct irrelevance variance, right, and affect the validity of your test. So these are things that I think, and I sent you this in the email calling for you to join me today, right? These are things that you have to keep in mind. Are your items and tasks fair, valid, right? And any language included in your items and tasks clear, precise, and at your students' level. So we're going to go and we're going to discuss how to avoid certain things and what to do, and based on research and what experts say. And gotta say that experts do not agree a lot of times on what is best. So I will show it to you, and then you take it with a grain of salt. Some things yes, but some things there hasn't been enough research, right? All right, but I'm going to give you a pop quiz before we move on, another one. So when you develop an assessment item and task, you need to keep several things in mind, right? The item or the task should. So I have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bullet points and 5 adjectives. So I'll give you 2 minutes to take a look and see if you can match. I'm going to give you a matching exercise. If you can match the adjectives to the bullet points. One more minute. All right, so I'm going to start before actually talking about the answers with a way that I could have made this matching exercise better. But before I tell you what I could have done to make it better, does anybody have any ideas what I could have done to this exercise in particular to make this a better matching task or item? Any idea? Or what would you have done to make it better? You see here. Put numbers and letters to match. Yes, definitely. So 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, and D, as opposed to just bullet points.
One more thing is the instruction on how I need to answer this question. Because there might be like 2 of the matching on the right column that I can use. But I'm not sure if that was in the instruction or even like if that was one of the expectations. So there is no instruction. I don't know what to do.
Perfect. Yes. So making it clear, right? If can you repeat an option, right? Should all options be used? And I see here in the chat added an extra option, right? It's always it adds to the challenge of the task, in this case of a matching exercise, to have a different number of responses to the number of bullet points or number of items that you have here. So I should have had, for example, I don't know, transparent or something here, right? That could that would add to the difficulty of the task as well, right? Add one adjective, okay? An explanation that only one adjective can be used for one sentence. So I think here the instruction could be better, right? Like you're saying, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, and D, and then add more options in the responses, right? And then make it clear. Can you repeat one? Should all of them be used? How many will not be used, right? The one thing that is good, and I don't know if you noticed here, is that more time for this task. Yes, because I only gave you 2 minutes to do it. Yes. Awesome. The other thing that is good actually is that instead of repeating this part here, the item, task, should in all of them, you use it only once, right? This is what researchers suggest when you're writing multiple choice, matching exercises, and not true or false, but multiple choice and matching. If you have repeated information that would go into every option, make it part of the stem as opposed to part of the items here, right? So yes, I'm sorry I cannot give you extra time for this, but let's take a look here and see what your answers are, right? Whoops. Okay, all right. So if you want your item, your task, right, to elicit performance that engages the ability to be assessed, it will help ensure that your intended interpretations will be any ideas? It will be meaningful, right? It will provide meaning. If you correspond to the target language use tasks, it will help assure that your intended interpretations are generalizable. Yes, we got the answer here on the chat. If you avoid content that may be offensive, like biased, right? Topically, culturally, or linguistically inappropriate for some students, right? Avoid using test types or response formats that may be unfamiliar, right? It will help assure that your intended interpretations are impartial. Thank you, Patty. And if you provide, when you provide assessment records that are your tasks and your items should provide records for you of test takers' scores that are consistent, right? You're looking for reliability here. And be practical, right? To develop, administer, and use in the classroom. So I have another point to make here in terms of the quality of this question. Do you see that 1, 2, 3 have a different format than 4 and 5? So I have 1, 2, 3. This will help ensure blah, blah, blah. This will help assure blah, blah, blah. This will help assure blah, blah, blah. And then 4 and 5, they're not consistent with those 3. So if I would make this question better, I would also rephrase the last 2 bullet points, right? To make sure that everything is consistent, right? Many adjectives might fit in the same sense, so you want to make sure that you only have one option that is correct, right? All right, so we have here, and this comes from Beckman and Denbach. And if you remember that diagram that I showed you guys in the beginning with the links, right, for assessment use, everything stems from your assessment task, right? The interpretations that you make, the decisions that you make, and the consequences all stems from your assessment tasks. Well, when you're developing your tasks, your items, right? Then you have to think from the top to the bottom, right? If you're thinking about assessment use. So when you're thinking about developing something, well, you have to argue, okay, the consequences of this task will be beneficial, right? My decisions that I'm going to make here are not going to be impartial. My interpretations are going to be relevant, sufficient, meaningful, generalizable, and impartial as well, right? My records will be consistent, and then you develop your task, right? So here it's actually going the other direction from the assessment use. Now you're going from assessment development here, right? So it's very important to keep those things in mind as you're developing your test. The links and everything is linked together, and it boils down to your tasks, right? To your choice of tasks, to how many tasks you have and how many items you have in your test. Well, and we all know, like, constructing items and tasks demands complex technical skills and sophisticated levels of thinking. If you want to create a good test, a reliable test, a valid test, it requires a lot of time. It's not something that you can put together in 5 minutes, and it's something that you shouldn't put together in 5 minutes. Oh, I'm just going to go to the copy room and make copies of this exercise and let's see what happens, right? It shouldn't be like this. And we have the responsibility, right, to decide what questions to ask and whether these questions are of appropriate difficulty and fair for the test population, right? We know our students, we know their level, we know the learning outcomes of our course. So we have that responsibility in our hands to choose what is appropriate for them, right? And make our tests biased for best. We want our test takers to show us what they can do and what they have learned. We don't want our tests to be tricky. We don't want them to be too much above the level of the students, too much challenges just to prove a point, right? So we have that responsibility, and we have to keep the development and the links that I just mentioned before, right? What are the consequences of this? What are the interpretations that I'm going to make based off of the results of this test, right? So we have to be very careful. And I'm going to say it again, even with the shortest quiz or the shortest, not shortest quiz, that's not what I want to say. Even with like the assessment that has the lowest percentage in your overall grading framework, right? The quiz can be worth 1%. Well, it is an important quiz, you know, put care into it. Don't just, you know, create it out of nowhere in 2 minutes before class starts. And that's where assessment literacy comes into place, right? And that's why you're all here and you're all engaging and becoming better test writers and task writers. You want to hear something maybe that you haven't learned before, right? Or you want to see what other people have to say about these things. So it's very important that we develop our assessment literacy so that we are aware of the implications in choosing different test formats, right? Sometimes you see teachers that have no idea, okay, how is this impacting the class, or how is this impacting whether the student is going to move up to another level, or their learning, their motivation in my class, right? And the type of response and the type of task, the type of elicitation mode that you have can impact and will impact the student's ability to demonstrate what they actually know or can do. Right. Our last webinar of this year, I'm going to be talking about the social dimension, right? For example, giving a group task, a group discussion, right? How do interlocutors affect their test takers' performance, right? If you're interviewing somebody, how do you as the interviewer affect the performance of that test taker, right? So things like gender, social status, level of proficiency. So all of these things can affect somebody's performance, right? And we as teachers and test developers, we want to get to, okay, what is the true ability? What is my students' true ability? What they know and what they can do with the language. And that responsibility lies in how we design our tests and how we design our items and our tests and the choices that we make regarding assessment, right? So also in the email that I sent you, I put together a few questions as well that I often ask myself too. What does research suggest about the number of options? Should I have 4 options? Should I have 5? Should I have 3, right? Is there a rule about the need to balance the position of the correct answers? Or can I have A, B, C, D, or A, B, A, B, A, B, right? Is there a problem with using options such as none of the above or all of the above, right? Can multiple choice questions be used to measure higher level thinking, right? What do experts recommend for preparing constructive response tasks, right? Options, can we have options within each task? And like I said in the beginning of this webinar, and I'm going to share with you, there is a lot of research in educational measurement. A lot of experts don't seem to get into a consensus for some of these, but there is some consensus for others. So these were the ones that we're going to be focusing on. Okay. So as we move forward, let's talk a little bit about multiple choice items, right? So you have STEM and response. Now, this is something that I have to tell you I learned fairly recently, because I used to have 4 choices for both, for all reading, vocabulary, grammar. Whenever I had a multiple choice item, I would usually have 4 options, right? 1 key answer and then 3 distractors. But actually research suggests, and this is the consensus in the literature, that for listening multiple choice questions, there should be only 3 as opposed to 4, right? So I don't know if this is new information to you, but it was new information to me until recently. So the advantages, of course, I'm going to skip through this because it's like we all know the advantages of multiple choice items, right? They are more reliable if you're reading well. There's less contamination of skills, right? Easy to score, and familiarity of the students with the format, right? However, they do not lend themselves to testing productive skills. Teachers often forget that they can also be used to assess higher order thinking skills, right? They can encourage guessing, and it is very challenging at times. So even though it's easy to score, it's very challenging to actually write plausible distractors and produce good items. Okay. I have to share this. There was a teacher that I know that, do you guys know this animal, right? The platypus. And I don't know if it was a joke or if he actually did that, but he said that for every multiple choice item that he created, he used the word platypus as one of the distractors. So no matter what kind of the test was, he would always include platypus in his tests as one of the distractors for the students. And he would get a kick out of students actually choosing the word platypus for something that made no sense. Like it was clearly not the right answer, but he would use that. This is something that we should not do. I don't know if he was joking or if he was not joking, but if you do that, researchers highly discourage such thing, using crazy distractors, because then that gives out that is the answer. That is not the answer, right? So tips for writing good multiple choice items. Write items that test only one concept, take background knowledge into account, right? When you're writing, like how much context should you give? And also, if a student has the background knowledge on this and a student doesn't have background knowledge on this, will they perform differently? Will they perform better or worse, right? Provide as much context as possible. Keep sensitive and fairness issues in mind. Standardize the number of response options. So even if you choose 4 or 3, make sure that all of your items have 4 or 3, right? One response option should be an unambiguous correct or best answer. They should be similar in length and level of difficulty. And they do actually suggest avoid using distractions like none of the above or all of the above, because what research has shown by analyzing lots of different tests is that usually when teachers use all of the above or none of the above, it's usually that is usually the answer. And test savvy students usually will pick up on that and they will choose that answer, right? And also, for example, with things like all of the above, if you have 2 options that are that are correct, then you already know that the answer is all of the above, right? Even if you're not sure if the 3rd option is correct or not. So they actually recommend to avoid using distractors like none of the above or all of the above. Correct answers should appear equally in all positions. So don't have all correct answers to be letter A, or all answers correct to be letter B, or a pattern, right? They should appear equally in all positions. Move recurring information in response options to the stem, like I did in the matching exercise, right? And avoid writing absurd or giveaway distractors like platypus. And avoid extraneous clues. For example, if you have a fill in the blank item, so it's the multiple choice item is not a question, is a fill in the blank, and then you have the options and you say "and," for example, you know that the next word will start with a vowel. So then make sure that either all your options start with a vowel or that you put a parenthesis "and," right? So that it's not clear to the student what option it is. So actually, let me show you here something really quick. Give me 1 second. And I'm going to share this with you guys as well. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, Assessing English Language Learners. If you're familiar with this book, can you see on my screen here? They have a section with common multiple choice question item violations. And I think it's very important to go over them. We're not going to have time here, but it's something that I'm going to share with you, and it's important to remind ourselves, right? So grammatical inconsistency, right? Anything that could give away the answer, right? So you want to make sure that, for example, letter D is not a good distractor, right? Because you have by, you have the verbs, you're focusing on the verbs, and then you have many shops here. It's not a good distraction. This is an example, like I was saying, for the extraneous cues or clues, right? I only want an, you know for a fact is going to be apple here, not pot of soup, big steak, or candy bar, right? Because of the N here. 3-for-1 split. So here, for example, you have gerund, right? Infinitive and a verb, and then you have a noun, right? You want to avoid this type of options. Impure items are items that test more than one thing. So going back to the concept of testing only one item. Apples and oranges, some subsuming response options, unparalleled options, and then the length is all awkward too. So it's not parallel in either grammar or length. Gender bias in language, right? Sensitivity, double answer or key, right? More than one response option is correct, no answer is correct, and giveaway distractors, right? So I'm going to share this with you, but if you have this book, I would strongly recommend going back to what they recommend here in terms of what violations are and how you can fix them, right? Go back here. So in the article that I shared with you prior to the webinar, they mentioned other research in educational measurement that has actually looked at each rule and then analyzed each rule in tests. And they also write, they give guidelines and rules and suggestions as derived from textbooks in educational measurement, right? And this is the one, like I said, take it with a grain of salt. There are some things here that you want to actually follow, but there are other things that may not be applicable to the type of questions that you're writing, right? But these are good suggestions in general. One other thing that's something that I see a lot whenever I review tests, and it's using things like never, always, 100%, right? So you don't want to use that, all, never, always, those words that can be very specific, right? And it gives a clue that it's probably not the right answer. Again, they say here, avoid or use sparingly the phrase all of the above, the phrase none of the above, right? Like, for example, incorporate common errors of students in distractors. Yes, but then should you use grammatically incorrect distractors or not? So I would say do not use grammatically incorrect distractors, but then if you're following this, then you're going to be using grammatically incorrect distractors, right? For example. Unless it is the grammar test. Yes, so that's what I meant by like, make sure that you're thinking about this in the context of what you're assessing, right? And this is where it comes from. They did a lot of research. They did a taxonomy first, and then they wrote in the same year an article that was like the validity of this taxonomy. And then like years later in 2002, they went back to the taxonomy, and then they did the research again. So it's actually really interesting to read and see the lack of consensus in some of them, and the lack of research for some too. Like there's has not been a lot of research. So for true or false items, usually there are two possible alternatives, right? But I put an asterisk here because you can also have true, false, not given, right? Or not enough information. And they're typically written as statements. You can test large amounts of content. They typically require less time. Scoring is also quick and easy. But especially if you have the only true or false, there's a 50% guessing factor, right? And so to overcome that, you can use a third category. You can also ask students to correct false statements, or you can also or ask students to find supporting information in the text for both correct statements and incorrect statements. So these are a way to make the fact, okay, they're not just guessing, they're actually giving me an explanation. But then scoring is not that easy, right? And have you ever had this experience when you actually ask students to write true or false, and sometimes they write a T that looks like an F, or an F that looks like a T, right? I couldn't find an exact representation of that online, but so the recommendation is actually to have students circle true or F or not given, as opposed to having them write T or F, right? Because some of them will try to do that. This is something that I think it depends, right? If you're doing, for example, a reading test, you want to test for main ideas, and you also want to test for details. So, so it is based, like, take this and apply it to your context, right? Questions should always be written at a lower level of language difficulty than the text, right? Also consider the effects of background knowledge. Questions should appear in the same order as the answers appear in the text. Make sure you paraphrase questions in simple, clear language. Do not copy exactly from the text. Avoid absoluteness clues. For example, always, never, like things that indicate 100% or 0%. Focus each item on a single idea. Avoid answer patterns. Include enough questions, right? Add a third option, and have students circle true, false, or not given, right? And for the last part, what do experts recommend for constructive response tasks? It's basically related to two things: the preparation of two aspects, the preparation of the task itself and the scoring, right? Some examples of constructive response tasks that we've talked about before. And this, so remember that I showed you the other, oh yeah, sometimes students write V instead of T because V means verdadero, true in Spanish, yes. So it's good to have the circle, right? So Hogan and Murphy did exactly the same research that Halidina and the other person, I forget the name now, did a couple of times for the taxonomy of the multiple choice of items. They did for constructed response items. And so these, and they looked at 25 different sources, and that's why you see the frequency here. What do people suggest for writing constructed response tasks, right? So you can see the logistics for CR items showed up in 20 out of the 25 sources, right? Avoid using optional items. It showed up in 17 of them. I don't know where I stand in that, because, for example, if you give students an essay and you give them 2 topics, right, then they can choose from each topic. Well, then they can choose what they want to write. So you're giving them the choice to do that. But then how reliable are your scores across the board if students choose this one and then if other students choose this topic? So like in assessment, sometimes you create more problems trying to solve other problems, right? So you give them the option to choose what topic they prefer to write about, but then that causes a problem of consistency and reliability of scores. So pick and choose what problem you're going to solve and how are you going to go about it, right? So 17 out of 25 sources they recommend avoid using optional items, right? In terms of if you have more items, less item, if you have fewer items, more time per item, right? And I think number 12 is so important. Identify mental processes required. It will feed the time limit that you're giving the student, right? It will be it's important for everything else. So I don't understand why it only showed up as a recommendation in 3 out of 25 sources. I think the mental processes required to answer the task should be something that it's like on our priority list, right? And then, so this is for preparing, and they also have for scoring items, right? Score anonymously, score 1 item at a time. Do you do that when you're giving open-ended questions? Do you score 1 item per test, and then you go back and you score the second item, right? That's what they suggest in 21 out of 25, right? Anonymously, you can do that, especially now that a lot of it is delivered online. You can download and then erase their names. But if they're actually writing to you, I know my students' handwriting, it's never anonymously because I know who wrote what, right? So these are some recommendations for scoring constructed response items. And they also, in the article, they give, they summarize the preparation guidelines and the scoring guidelines. And you will have access to this. And we're running out of time here. I talk way too much. But I do want to talk about this. Suggestions for revising your test, right? Once you finish your test, think about to yourself. Yes, Kitty, let's see here. Give me 1 second.
Thank you so much.
Yes, there you go. There you go. So are the directions to each section absolutely clear, right? Is there an example item? If not, are the directions and formats so familiar that they clearly understand the tasks? Does each item measure a specified objective? Is there a single correct answer for each question? Is each item stated in clear, simple language? Difficulty of each item appropriate? Language sufficiently authentic? Is there a balance between easy and difficult items? Do you start with easy items? That's what's recommended in the research, right? You start a test always with something that is easier to get students motivated to like lower that anxiety level. So you always start with easy tasks and then you progressively get harder. And does the sum of the items in the test as a whole adequately reflect the learning objectives, right? I think this is very important for us to keep in mind. So are they, and of course, are they equally important or not? Are some more fundamental than others? And please, for all the effort that you put into it, take your own test. Go through each set of questions and all items slowly and deliberately. Time yourself. Make sure the test is neat and uncluttered on the page. The way it looks, do the students have enough space to write, right? I've seen tests that are requiring students to write a paragraph and they give them 1 line. Don't do that, right? Make sure it is clear and unambiguous, and make sure it reflects all the care and precision that you put into it, because it shows. It shows when the teacher has put care into it and when the teacher hasn't, right? And I think that's very important, that we show our students that we're actually thinking through our assessments, even if it is only 1% of our grade, right? And I know time is precious for us as teachers. We don't have a lot of time to create our lessons, to grade, to create assessments, but I think we should devote the time that is needed to create good, reliable, and sound assessments. Okay? So this was it, what I had to share with you today. I will send an email with extra resources for you, including the ones from this book about the multiple choice questions, and some other articles if you're interested in reading them, and reading more into the actual research and educational measurement. I would like to thank you again for joining me today, and also I would like also to thank ITAP for sponsoring this webinar, and I hope to see you in the next one on the first week of September on Wednesday. So thank you very much. I hope you learned something new. I hope maybe I said something that made you think. And like I said, always think about your context, always think about your students and the types, what you want to get from them when you are designing your tasks and your items, and when you decide to choose to actually follow some of these instructions or not. But then do it deliberately, do it consciously, with the goal of assessing and getting your students' true ability, right? So that should be our goal when we are creating our assessments. So you will also have access to the slides, and there I have my references here for what I was talking about, and so you can also access those through library or online on Google Scholar. So thank you so much for sharing and for staying with me until the very end. 11:03, I'm 3 minutes late, but thank you so much. I will be here if you would like to talk a little bit more with me. If not, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I hope to see you in September. The slides link I am going to share with the email that I sent, okay? Thank you so much. It is not edible, so let me go ahead. I'm going to, okay. It will send me an email to my Gmail account. I can give you, if you request access, I will give you access, so don't worry about it, okay? And you'll get a score report from Emma at the Society. Thank you so much.